It was a quiet, sunlit morning in my suburban neighborhood, the kind where even the birds seemed to pause and enjoy the calm. I was sipping coffee on my porch, relishing the rare moment of peace before the day's chaos began. Little did I know, that peace was about to shatter in the most unexpected and absurd way imaginable. Across the street, Karen, my notoriously dramatic neighbor, was pacing furiously in front of my driveway. I had seen her tantrums before, but this one carried a different energy, intense, urgent, and most importantly directed at me. My curiosity shifted quickly to apprehension as I noticed her pulling out her phone, fingers trembling as she dialed 911. I froze, taking a slow sip of coffee, the realization dawning on me. She was calling the police, over my driveway. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a punchline in slow motion. Little did she know, the person she was about to report wasn't just any homeowner. I was the police chief of this town. I set my coffee down, trying to keep my expression calm. This was one of those moments where every second mattered. Karen was about to escalate a trivial personal grudge into a full-blown emergency report, and she had no idea she was stepping into territory she could not control. I walked toward her casually, letting her panic simmer for a moment. "Morning, Karen," I said evenly. "Everything okay?" Her face turned pale, phone still raised. You can't just park there," she stammered. "It's illegal." I raised an eyebrow, fighting a smirk. "Karen, that's my driveway, and that's my car. I live here." Her mouth opened and closed, words failing her. The phone in her hand was still connected to 911, and the operator was waiting on the line, ready to process her frantic complaint. I realized that I had two options: defuse this with humor and calm authority, or let it spiral into a spectacle that would have the whole neighborhood watching. I chose the first. With a deep breath, I stepped closer, letting the morning sun glint off my uniform. Not just any uniform, the one that marked me as the police chief. Her eyes widened, disbelief washing over her features. The indignation, the rage, the smug sense of control she had felt all evaporated in an instant. This was the beginning of a lesson she would never forget. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, phone still clutched in her hand. Her expression had shifted from indignation to outright panic, and I could almost see the mental gears turning. This was not going according to her plan. She had expected compliance, maybe even fear, but certainly not recognition. Not realization that the person she was calling the authorities on was the police chief himself. She finally stammered, I didn't know." Her voice trailed off, disbelief evident in every word. The phone, still connected to 911, rang faintly as the operator waited, completely unaware of the suburban drama unfolding. She had no idea that her moment of perceived power was evaporating in real time. I took a casual step closer, masking the surge of adrenaline I felt. "Karen," I said calmly, "you called 911 over a driveway. I'm assuming you realize now that's my driveway." Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Words failed her. You're," she began, but no words could capture her shock. The realization hit her in waves. Every frantic action she had taken over the past few minutes was rendered absurd. "Chief," I finished for her, letting the single word hang in the air. It carried authority, clarity, and finality. Her eyes went wide. She tried to regain composure, crossing her arms and muttering, "Rules are rules," but even she knew the statement was weak now. I let her panic simmer, giving her the chance to reflect, to grasp the gravity of what she had done. Around us, neighbors began peeking from windows, curtains twitching as whispers and quiet gasps traveled down the street. Karen's humiliation was becoming a public spectacle, yet she remained unaware of just how noticeable her fluster had become. I decided to step closer still, allowing calm authority to dominate the moment. "Karen," I said evenly, "it's important to understand boundaries. Calling 911 is serious. Misusing it can have consequences. This isn't about rules, it's about respect, understanding, and context. Her face went red, a mix of embarrassment, anger, and disbelief. She muttered a half-hearted apology, fumbling for words. The phone in her hand was finally set aside, forgotten for now. I realized in that moment that this was only the beginning. Karen's pride, her need to control, and her obsession with being right would not simply vanish. The situation had escalated beyond a driveway dispute. It was now a psychological chess match. And I, as the police chief, was ready to navigate it. Little did Karen know, the events of that morning would set off a chain reaction that would engulf the entire neighborhood in drama, humor, and lessons in humility. I thought the immediate panic had settled, but in small neighborhoods, peace is often temporary. Karen retreated to her house, but I could see the storm brewing through her curtains. She wasn't done, far from it. I knew her type. When pride was wounded, plotting was inevitable. The next morning, subtle signs of her strategy appeared. A stack of pamphlets labeled driveway violations and community safety lay neatly on my porch. Each pamphlet was meticulously written, exaggerating every tiny action I had taken in my driveway over the past year. It was a theatrical blend of obsession and logic. I couldn't help but smile. Most people would panic, but I had dealt with all types of neighborly disputes before. Still, Karen's dedication to turning a minor incident into a public spectacle was impressive. In a completely absurd way. Her antics escalated quickly. By the end of the week, small lawn signs appeared near her home, "Protect our streets," and "No driveway abuse." At first, I ignored them, knowing that engaging prematurely would give her exactly the reaction she wanted. But her next move made it clear that this wasn't a harmless hobby, it was an all-out campaign. One evening, I caught her lurking near my property, notebook in hand, pretending to prune flowers while scribbling furiously. When our eyes met, she froze, forcing a casual smile that looked anything but casual. She was documenting, plotting, and preparing for another escalation. I realized then that Karen's obsession had evolved from anger into strategy. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was determined. And while neighbors whispered and laughed quietly behind curtains, I knew I had to act strategically. Any misstep could turn this into a public feud rather than a contained lesson. So I began my counter-strategy, slowly, methodically. Observation first. Documentation second. Humor and calm authority always at the core. I catalogued her pamphlets, notes, and photos. Every movement, every attempt to escalate, was noted. I was ready for the next act, knowing it would come, and it did. The following morning, I staged a small, harmless driveway obstruction. A single traffic cone, perfectly positioned, was all it took. Within minutes, Karen appeared, notebook in hand, snapping photos and muttering about violations. She had taken the bait. I stepped onto my porch, casually observing her frantic energy. "Morning, Karen," I said with a calm smile. "I see you're keeping track of my driveway activities." Her eyes widened. She didn't realize she was now the one being observed. Little did Karen know, this was only the opening move in a game she had no idea how to win. Karen's obsession had reached a new level. Every morning, I could see her peeking from her curtains, notebook in hand, analyzing my driveway like it was a crime scene. Her determination was impressive if absurd, but I knew I couldn't let this spiral out of control. It was time to turn the tables. I began documenting her antics carefully. Every pamphlet, note, photo, and whispered comment was catalogued. Not for revenge, but for strategy. Understanding her patterns gave me control. I knew how she thought, how she escalated, and most importantly, how predictable her next moves would be. Then came the perfect opportunity. I placed a harmless traffic cone in front of my car, positioned carefully to suggest a minor violation. Nothing serious, just enough to provoke a reaction. Within minutes, Karen appeared, notebook in hand, eyes wide with excitement and panic. She was ready to escalate again. I stepped onto the porch casually, keeping my demeanor calm, almost amused. "Morning, Karen," I said lightly. "It looks like there's a small obstruction here. Interesting, isn't it?" Her face turned red as she snapped photos and muttered about illegal driveway activity. I watched her carefully, noting every gesture, every flinch, every frantic scribble in her notebook. She had unknowingly stepped into the trap I had prepared, observed without consequence, catalogued without judgment, and about to be exposed to the reality of her obsession. I decided to confront her, but on my terms. "Karen," I said evenly, "I see you've been very diligent documenting everything. That kind of effort is impressive. But I think it's time we have a calm conversation about boundaries and perspective." Her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time, she hesitated. She realized that her actions were no longer private, they were under scrutiny. The tables had turned. She was no longer the accuser. She was the observed, the documented, the one under evaluation. Neighbors began to peek from windows, curiosity pulling them toward the unfolding scene. Karen stiffened, realizing the public attention she had drawn. Her carefully constructed narrative of moral superiority was unraveling, right there on my porch. This was just the beginning. I had set the stage for a lesson she would never forget, one that combined authority, patience, and strategy. Karen's determination had met its match, and the final act of this suburban drama was about to unfold. The morning air was crisp, carrying a tension that seemed to hum across the neighborhood. Karen arrived at my porch with her notebook clutched tightly, eyes darting around, ready to document every perceived infraction. She expected to assert control, but she had no idea what was coming. I greeted her calmly, offering a seat and a coffee. "Karen, thank you for coming," I said evenly. "I think it's time we review everything together." My tone was light, but each word carried authority. She blinked in confusion. This wasn't what she expected. She had imagined confrontation, yelling, perhaps even fear, but not calm, measured confidence. I set a folder on the table, thick with pamphlets, notes, photos, and printed messages from her obsessive campaign. Every frantic move she had made over the past week was documented. Her jaw dropped. For the first time, she realized the extent of her own obsession. "I've reviewed everything you've submitted," I continued. "It's thorough." Karen's lips trembled as she muttered, I was just trying to protect the neighborhood." I nodded. "I understand. Intent matters, and you believed you were acting in good faith. But intent doesn't excuse misuse of authority, harassment, or false complaints. What we're discussing now is boundaries, yours, mine, and everyone's in this neighborhood." Her shoulders slumped slightly. The fight, the drama, the public performance she had built around this incident, all of it was crumbling under the weight of truth and calm authority. She glanced nervously at the folder, finally seeing herself from an outside perspective. I leaned back, letting silence do its work. "Karen, the driveway is mine, my authority is clear, and the neighborhood respects boundaries when they're respected in return. I think we've reached a point where we can both move forward." Her eyes flickered with acknowledgement, and she gave a hesitant nod. The tension in the air began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet realization. She had been trying to control something that was never hers to control, and the lesson was now undeniably clear. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, whispering quietly. Some smiled, some chuckled, but all witnessed the subtle yet powerful lesson being delivered. Patience, strategy, and calm authority often speak louder than anger or accusation. By the end of the conversation, Karen's notebook remained unopened on her lap. She had no more words, no more complaints, and no more leverage. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the neighborhood watched as the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Little did Karen know, the aftermath would spread lessons, gossip, and reflections throughout the entire neighborhood, creating stories that would last for months. The day after the confrontation, the neighborhood had changed subtly but noticeably. The streets were the same, the houses unchanged, but the energy was different. Karen had retreated to her home, her notebook now untouched, her pamphlets gone, and her usual frantic presence muted. The confrontation had left its mark. Neighbors began to act differently around me. A casual wave here, a quiet nod there, small gestures that carried an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. Some whispered to each other about the driveway incident, while others openly laughed at the absurdity of Karen calling 911 over what was, in reality, her neighbor's private driveway. Karen, of course, was still trying to regain control. I noticed her pacing near her front yard, peeking occasionally through her curtains, as if calculating her next move. She wasn't aggressive anymore, her energy had shifted from confrontation to anxious plotting. I knew she was trying to repair her reputation, but in subtle ways that had little effect. Some neighbors began offering advice, cautiously at first, on how to deal with Karen without escalating matters. Whispered strategies, tips for patience, even casual warnings appeared. The neighborhood had subtly united, not out of malice toward her, but out of a shared understanding of boundaries and the importance of perspective. Meanwhile, Karen's attempts at redemption were less than effective. She tried hosting small get-togethers, inviting neighbors to discuss community safety, but attendance was sparse. She baked cookies to smooth things over, but the cookies mysteriously disappeared before she could even offer them. Her efforts, though earnest, only highlighted the earlier chaos she had created. Through it all, I maintained a calm presence. Observing Karen's actions, noting the reactions of neighbors, and ensuring boundaries were respected became a subtle exercise in strategy and patience. I didn't need to escalate further, the situation was resolving itself as long as I stayed calm and authoritative. By the end of the week, it became clear that the immediate crisis had passed. Karen's obsession had faded, her public campaign dissolved, and the neighborhood had absorbed the story as a cautionary tale. What started as a minor driveway dispute had evolved into a legendary lesson in patience, humility, and respect. Yet, I knew better than to assume it was over entirely. Karen's stubbornness, determination, and desire to assert control meant that a spark of mischief could reignite at any moment. I stayed vigilant, knowing that even a small act could test the neighborhood's hard-won balance once more. Little did anyone know, the next chapter in this suburban saga was quietly taking shape, and when it came, it would be unforgettable for Karen, for the neighbors, and for me. Just when the neighborhood seemed to have returned to its quiet rhythm, Karen re-emerged. She had spent days quietly plotting, observing, and strategizing. Her notebook was back in hand, and the glint in her eyes suggested she was ready to escalate again. This wasn't just stubbornness anymore, it was a full-blown campaign of revenge. The first signs were subtle. A hastily written note appeared on a lamppost near my driveway. Small, seemingly innocent footprints were visible in the garden path. And, of course, one of her infamous pamphlets reappeared on my porch, this time carefully folded and sealed with tape. Karen's obsession had shifted into calculated, passive-aggressive action. I could see her peering from her windows, trying to assess my reaction. Her strategy was clear: create a minor disturbance, gauge my response, and adjust accordingly. This was no longer about rules or safety, it was about regaining a sense of control she had lost during the confrontation. I decided it was time to respond, but strategically. I photographed the driveway and the notes, documenting each of her moves. Then, instead of reacting with anger or confrontation, I crafted a playful, light-hearted message for the neighborhood group chat: driveway obstacle course courtesy of Karen, creativity points, 10/10. Within minutes, the post went viral in the neighborhood. Neighbors commented with laughter, shared their own anecdotes about quirky incidents, and subtly sided with me. Karen, unknowingly, had become the star of a community-wide joke rather than a figure of authority. Her face, visible through her curtains, registered disbelief and frustration. She had expected intimidation, compliance, or at least some semblance of panic, but instead, she had created a spectacle where she was the punchline. The power she had tried to reclaim slipped further from her grasp. Still, Karen wasn't defeated. I could see her formulating her next move, muttering to herself, and scribbling new ideas in her notebook. Her obsession, although now tinged with embarrassment, was relentless. She was committed to asserting control over something that was never hers. I knew I had to be ready. This was more than a driveway feud now, it was a psychological game of strategy, patience, and subtle authority. Each move, each reaction, had to be calculated. Karen was relentless, but she was predictable. And predictability is power when wielded correctly. Little did Karen know, the final act was already in motion. The stage was set, the neighbors were watching, and the conclusion to this suburban saga would be unforgettable both for her and for everyone else on the street. The neighborhood had been buzzing for days. Karen's antics had become legendary, whispered about behind curtains and across lawns. Everyone knew about her driveway obsession and the 911 call fiasco. The stage was set, and it was time for the final act. I invited Karen over under the guise of a community discussion, letting her believe she still held some influence. She arrived with her notebook clutched tightly, eyes scanning every detail, expecting confrontation but not the calm, measured authority that awaited her. "Karen, thank you for coming," I said warmly, gesturing to a chair. "I thought it would be helpful to review everything together and clear the air." My tone was friendly, but there was an underlying firmness she could feel. She stiffened, clearly realizing this wouldn't be her usual theatrical showdown. I placed a thick folder on the table. Inside were all her pamphlets, photos, notes, and messages. Everything she had done over the past weeks, every frantic effort to document and control was catalogued neatly. Her jaw dropped, her face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. She hadn't expected her obsessive campaign to be collected, analyzed, and reflected back at her so clearly. "I've gone through everything you submitted," I said evenly. "It's detailed, thorough, even." Karen's lips quivered. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she muttered. I nodded. "I understand your intent. But good intentions don't excuse harassment or false claims. What we're discussing now is respect, boundaries, and perspective. Everyone here deserves that, including you." Her posture slumped. The fight, the drama, the narrative of moral superiority she had constructed all crumbled under the weight of undeniable truth. For the first time, she saw her actions from another perspective, chaotic, obsessive, and ultimately fruitless. I leaned back, letting silence underscore the lesson. "Karen, the driveway is mine. My authority is clear. The neighborhood respects boundaries when they are respected in return. I believe we can both move forward now." Her eyes flickered with understanding, and she nodded slowly. The tension dissolved, replaced by quiet acknowledgement. The confrontation had reached its peak, and Karen, at last, grasped the consequences of her obsession. Neighbors peeked from windows, smiling and whispering quietly. The street had witnessed a lesson in patience, strategy, and authority, all delivered without escalating into anger or chaos. Karen had been defeated not with force, but with calm, calculated authority. Little did anyone know, the story of that driveway, the 911 call, the pamphlets, the obsession would become neighborhood legend. And the final act of this suburban drama would be remembered for years as a tale of pride, persistence, and the power of calm control. The days following the showdown were peaceful, almost eerily so. The chaos that Karen had unleashed over a simple driveway had finally subsided. The neighborhood, once buzzing with whispers and speculation, returned to its quiet rhythm. The streets, the houses, even the lawn decorations seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Karen had retreated to her home. Her notebook remained closed, her pamphlets nowhere to be found. The frantic energy that had defined her actions had dissipated, replaced with a subdued reflection. She walked past my driveway occasionally, but there was no aggression, no judgment, only a tentative acknowledgement that the feud had ended. Neighbors, meanwhile, had absorbed the story like a living cautionary tale. Casual waves, polite nods, and quiet smiles were now accompanied by knowing glances. They had witnessed the subtle, effective way boundaries had been enforced without confrontation. The lesson was clear: patience, strategy, and calm authority are far more powerful than anger or theatrics. I often walked past my driveway, coffee in hand, observing the quiet suburban street. It was a peaceful scene, yet layered with the memory of the events that had unfolded. The driveway, once the center of a neighborhood drama, now stood clear and unchallenged, a symbol of order restored. Karen's attempts at redemption were muted but present. A friendly wave here, a hesitant nod there, subtle gestures that suggested she had internalized the lesson. Her public campaign of complaints, pamphlets, and 911 calls had ended, leaving her with the quiet understanding that boundaries, once crossed, carry consequences. For me, the episode reinforced the delicate balance of patience and authority. As police chief, I had seen countless conflicts, but this one stood out not because it involved crime, but because it tested human behavior, pride, and persistence in a small community. Handling it required more than authority, it required observation, strategy, and a sense of humor. One evening, as the sun set over the quiet street, I reflected on the entire ordeal. Karen had tried to assert control, escalate a trivial matter, and dominate the narrative, but the resolution had been simple: understanding boundaries, responding with calm authority, and letting actions speak louder than accusations. The neighborhood had learned something, and so had she. The driveway was mine. Peace had returned. And the story of the 911 call, the pamphlets, and Karen's obsession would become a legendary tale in the neighborhood for years to come, a reminder that patience, strategy, and quiet authority always prevail.